second half of the basketball season is here, and the race to the playoffs is heating up. PrizePicks, the best place to cash in on your favorite sports. Sign up today, and you get $50
instantly
when you play $5. So you play $5, you get $50. Download the app today and use the code Shane, SHANE, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Download the app and use the code Shane to get $50 on your first $5.
Code Shane.
Run your game.
We're probably the most dynamic moment since the Apollo era on all things, sort of space, and these things can always go haywire.
SpaceX mishap, the latest Starship test flight ending with another explosion.
Now, space is by far dominated by commercial actors.
Only dreamers with the greatest passion and deepest pockets have decided to both use NASA and bypass it to relaunch America's space dominance.
The stakes are so high because these companies have spent so much money.
Ignition and liftoff. Go Falcon, go Starlink.
I think this is basically going to be a two-horse race between the United States and China from here on out.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Bango. Oh, Jesus Christ, that scared you. Ashlee Vance, I was just saying that movie, Wild Wild Space, is a hell of a movie, and I got a lot to ask you and to talk to you. I have a lot of questions. But I just remember in the comments, they're like, how does he have, because it's audio, do you have to smash it so hard it hurt my ears? So sorry, everybody. Ashlee Vance. So previously, and you're going to have to wait because I've got a lot of stuff to say about you.
That's all right.
Previously a writer for Bloomberg Business Week, New York Times, big one. Economist, probably my favorite. You have to be smart to write for them. The Register, the author of the best-selling biography on Elon Musk, and your latest book, When the Heavens Went on Sale, inspired a new documentary, which we were talking about, Wild Wild Space, which is, you have to watch, is one of the best documentaries I've ever seen.
Thank you.
Whoever controls space may very well control the future of humanity.
But this is a big week for you, big time,
Yeah.
because you founded your own business, Core Memory, like last week.
Yeah, for better or for worse, we'll see. But yeah, it's been a journalist for 20 years and then just got tired of doing stuff for other people. And so it's part production company. We're going to make more documentaries. And then we've put up our Substack shingle. So I'll write and do my podcast and everything there.
You kind of have to go it on your own because there's no real, it's not like when we were coming up, when you get in a newsroom like the New York Times or the Economist or Bloomberg or whatever, and you're set.
Yeah.
Like it's a bloodbath out there, and kind of economics only makes sense if you're doing it for yourself, no?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a mix. I was lucky. Bloomberg's, it was a pretty good place to work. I got to work on these feature stories, go all around the world.
They have
do
money.
Stuff. They have money. So
they spy on people using their machines.
We have you got the Wall Street business helping people like me, live a good life.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to understand this but you and me, but why wasn't that a bigger scandal when the terminals were spying on the biggest businesses?
Bloomberg News is at the center of a spying story. The company is apologizing for allowing its journalists access to computer terminals used by its financial customers.
Okay, so just if people don't know, Bloomberg has a big terminal business where there's, flow of information and stock things and, Wall Street and all the big Fortune 500 companies have them. And it turned out that they were not only sending, they were receiving. And that's not cricket, as they say. And I was like, hold on a second. They've been spying on, by the way, like media, spying on these Fortune 500 countries, and it wasn't a bigger scandal than that?
You're testing my memory
Sorry.
on all the specifics because if I remember right, Bloomberg's weird because it has these
divisions,
two sides of the house, and
they would never talk to each other.
I mean, they try not to.
Come on.
But I really honestly don't remember if it got to the reporter side or if it was.
Well, I'm sure they said it didn't.
Data leaking.
But come on.
But I think probably. How much does the general public have sympathy for either side in that equation?
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. It's just a bunch of rich guys spying on each other. Who cares?
Yeah.
It's not a deflate gate or anything. Okay, well, that's enough talking shop. So, journalist, but like all good journalists, moved into stories and producing and documentaries. And this documentary is very funny and then gets very sort of serious and metaphysical by the end. I was amazed by the progression of the actual story. So it starts with some entrepreneurs.
A decade ago, out of a Silicon Valley garage, Planet began its stellar journey.
We've always had the goal of empowering humanity with imagery of the planet taken on a more frequent basis.
A bunch of these guys were hired by a sort of a freaky dude from NASA.
Pete Warden, he was a brigadier general, and then he takes over at NASA Center.
Yeah. Great character. Yeah. And so he puts the bad news bears together. Now, you follow these. How long did you follow them?
Like 6 years? 6 years, yeah.
And they come up with basically an iPhone in a tiny little thing which becomes a satellite.
Yeah.
This can take pictures 10 times the resolution of the big satellite here, even though it weighs 1,000th of the mass.
And they all realized that the economics would be better if they go it alone, and that they could actually, the technology is such that they could go out there, much like our journalist friends, saying, hey, I'm going to go do Substack, I'm going to go do this on my own.
Tiny, inexpensive Earth imaging powerhouses delivering data on demand.
So let's go back to the beginning, this fascinating story. How did you get the idea? And how did you happen upon these cats?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey. I'd done my biography on Elon that came out in 2015, and always my favorite part when I was reporting that book was SpaceX and then the early days of SpaceX. Yeah. And for people who don't know, the first SpaceX Falcon 1 rocket, it took off from Kwajalein, which is this tiny island on it's in a atoll between like Australia and Hawaii in the middle of nowhere. It was like kind of Gilligan's Island.
2, 1, 0.
This was like 2008 when it finally took off. So they spent like 5 years on this island trying to build this rocket, and there was like the beginning of commercial space kind of becoming real. Yeah. And so after I finished the book, a couple things happened. I mean, one is SpaceX had been doing a lot better, and so people had dreamed about commercial space for 30, 40 years. A bunch of rich people had tried and failed in the past, but then Elon made it work.
I need a new nervous system.
And so what I saw was all around the world, all of a sudden, these people were like, now we can do this. It kind of unlocked the idea that this was possible.
Yeah.
And so I saw.
So sorry, just to be clear, it had to be state actors previously and not
this
private.
This was a nation state only kind of thing, and it required billions of dollars, hundreds of people. You definitely would not just take this on. And then and Elon was like in the middle ground. People, we forget because he's so rich now. He was rich, but he had he put $100 million into SpaceX when he was worth about $200 million. Right. And so he was the first kind of non-billionaire to take a crack and made it work. And then I saw these people cropping up everywhere.
So they're raising just private equity.
Yeah, it went from nation state to like billionaire, then to 100 millionaire, then you could raise venture capital and take a crack at this. And so my book had opened up all this access. People were like, oh, you're the Elon guy. If you're knocking on our door, we'll let you come see what we're doing. And so I started out trying to write stories and do a book. And then I'm like, man, I'm in rooms that nobody ever gets to be in.
Right.
And I'd wanted to make, this was my first movie. I'd wanted to make a movie. And so I was like, screw it, man. I'll go try to get cameras in here.
Yeah.
And it worked. Yeah.
So they come up with microsatellites, and they can put more and more of these things. And if you have more of them, you can map more of the Earth. And what was previously run by, the CIA or, intelligence or NASA or whatever, and very few satellites, all of a sudden there's like tons of satellites, and there's tons of information. Now, I believe they were doing it to like the resolution. They wanted to see every tree because they wanted to sort of reforest things, and it was an environmental initiative.
Yeah, I mean, even the U.S. has a limited number of satellites that could image the Earth, and they could only look at handful of specific places. Like we want to watch what's going on in Russia right now. Yeah. And then, but Planet, this company Will Marshall started, they wanted to watch everything to track really like deforestation, like you mentioned, just sort of what was going on with the environment. So it starts from this it really was going to be a nonprofit. And then what they discovered quick was even nobody wanted to fund, to the amount of money that it would take even to sort of prove that out. There was no do-gooder enough that just wanted to see that happen.
Governments.
Right. Yeah. Well, so they had to sort of flip first to we're going to take venture capital money and turn this from a nonprofit to a business.
Yeah.
And then the governments become their biggest customers.
So this is what I love in the film, because it starts off with these entrepreneurs. They go to NASA. They learn some stuff. They go off on their own. They're launching rockets. The rockets are successful. They're launching satellites. The satellites are successful. Boom. And then we sort of have this Act 2 moment, which is, okay, governments come and say, hey, we want to know about this, and where are the missile silos, and where are these? And all of a sudden they realize the amount of information, the amount of data, the power that comes from space, which I didn't really think about it that much. Like you sort of know, and then all of a sudden it comes out like, holy crap, like we started out as sort of peaceniks, and all of a sudden people are like, okay, where are the rebels hiding, and all this stuff. Maybe explain a little bit about the transition there.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of why I wanted to write the book and do the movie. I could see all this stuff happening. Like, to the point you were making, I think if you go to a normal person on the street, they sort of like have no idea any of this is happening. Yeah. So, I mean, look, there's two sides to it. So, like, one truly it's like open source for the first time. I mean, any version of the truth we had before that was delivered from space was filtered through the United States government telling you what you're looking at, or the Russians telling you what you're looking at. Back to like the weapons of mass destruction. It's like, here's our satellite photo of this thing, and this is what it is, and they're
interpreting it.
Right, because they're the only ones with the pictures.
Oh, that's a great point too, because there's not only satellites, but you have to have people who can interpret the and they were the ones who would interpret, and then these guys developed better but more sophisticated interpretation.
Well, anyone could access their images. When the Ukraine war started, right, the Russians were like, we're not moving in. And the U.S. is saying, no, we think you're going to attack. It's like, who are you going to believe? Well, it was Planet's images where you saw all the Russian troops amassed in Belarus. And it's like, okay, this is coming from this sort of independent party.
That's amazing. Action. Prize Picks. Action is fun. Prize Picks is here for the second half of the basketball season. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money. That's not a typo. 1,000 times. It's a lot. 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Why? Because they invented a thing called Flex Play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. Do you think LeBron James will get more than 24 points this week, or Giannis will get more than 35 points? He gets a lot more points to do than LeBron. He's younger.
He is.
Fresh legs.
More energy.
More pop. Cook up hot takes with your friends and win real money.
Cook them up.
This basketball season, Prize Picks. Download the app today and use the code SHANE, S-H-A-N-E, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Download the app and use the code SHANE to get $50 on your first $5.
Code SHANE.
Pretty good.
Run your game.
Run your game. So, there's been a lot of fire out in California recently, and my house nearly burned down. And just as we started making progress on the cleanup, bango, mudslides. So before I knew it, I'm ankle deep in mud, and my flipper floppers got stuck in a muddy abyss. So I get a pair of Brunt boots in the mail, and I'm thinking, all right, let's see if these are as tough as everybody says. I put them on, and suddenly I'm in the hits of the 80s, walking through mud like I'm walking on sunshine from Katrina and the waves. I'm telling you, no slip, no sinking, just solid footing. Now I'm out there getting work done, moving debris, mudslides, no problem. These boots got me through it, and now I wear them for everything, even when I'm just kicking around the house. Seriously, they're that comfortable. Whether it's safety toe or soft toe, pull on or lace up, they've got you, and they're so confident you'll love these boots that they even let you try them risk-free. No, Brunt didn't just make a durable work boot. They reinvented comfort for the hardest workers out there. And for a limited time, our listeners get $10 off at Brunt by using the code SHANE at checkout. Just head to bruntworkwear.com/Shane and use the code SHANE, and you're all set. After your purchase, they will ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them that we sent you. So just to be clear, to go back,
Yep.
they start peaceniks saying, hey, we're going to map the trees
Yeah.
because we want to reforest stuff, and all of a sudden they're the ones documenting the Russian army amassing on the Ukrainian border.
100%. You know, if people think back, all the front pages you saw all on CNN, I mean, these images were everywhere. They were all coming from this company.
Yeah.
And this stuff, it just didn't exist before. You really did have to point satellites at where you knew things might be happening, whereas their satellites see everything,
everywhere.
and you had it over time, right? So
Yeah.
you could see the tanks coming in, you could see them sitting there, you could see like mass graves, you know, being dug later on in different areas. So there is that one side, but you're totally right. On the other side, it's you know, the U.S. government is salivating. It's like, oh well, now we can see everything all the time, everywhere.
They have more stuff than we do.
Right, absolutely. So they flipped it, and then, you know, the U.S. government a few years ago did this contract with Planet. It was like this all-you-can-eat sort of thing where it said, okay, you know, NASA's going to use this for climate change, and we're going to check crops for agriculture, but it was, you just have access to everything all the time.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
The CIA is not going to look at any of that stuff.
No. And that, no. And then, you know, it's interesting too, because now there's not many spacefaring nations, and there's not many that can afford to put a spy satellite up. And so, you know, you could quickly argue that, well, okay, now almost any country can also look at their citizens and what's happening in their countries.
Now that you have all these images, and it sort of is this transfer from state-run spy satellites, or satellites in general, they don't have to be spy satellites, but and a couple of them, or not many of them, to like thousands of sort of public ones. What are some of the unforeseen power / information / ethical problems that arise from that?
The most obvious one is like, look, Planet says there's 5 countries that we're not going to give access to these images, right? But I mean, like, this is now data on the internet. Anyone
Russia
with a Planet
can hack
account with a credit card, you know, can sign up for this service. So
so we would have like Russia, Iran.
Exactly. So everybody's getting access to all this data. There are crazy things that happen. You know, there's for example, when North Korea is going to send up a missile to do a test missile launch, they now know that these satellites are watching, and so you not only do it where you make sure that everybody can see what you're doing, they also often, you know, start doing stock trades on the South Korean stock market because they know it's going to drop out of fear.
So wait. The North Koreans, DPRK does stock trades. Shorting, I'm assuming.
Yeah, because they know this test is going to freak everybody in the region out, and they know exactly when the test is going to happen, and then they make sure there's visual proof.
Satellite images suggest North Korea likely launched a short-range missile on Saturday.
Now you can see like the sum total of sort of human activity on the planet,
right.
and it's being monitored in real time. So there are a million like good and bad things that you could do with that.
Like, what are some of the bad things?
You might want to monitor refugees to make sure they're okay. You might also want to monitor some other population to, you know, make sure you're able to keep control of them and they're not doing things that you don't want them to be doing.
And it's fairly easy to access this information.
You go on your internet browser. There's really weird stuff that happened too. I write about this guy. He was an undergraduate student, 22 years old. He found all these nuclear missile silos in China that had been hidden in the desert, just like sort of as a hobby. And so,
don't with cats.
Yeah. Well, it's not clear if the U.S. knew about these or not, but they certainly hadn't told anybody that they knew. Right. And now you just have this kid who's like on his blog, and he found all these. There was about 40 silos. We didn't know. It was front page news on the Times, Washington Post, all that stuff. So, you know, all these balance of power elements get flipped.
So before, famously, the space race was between 2 countries, Soviet Union, America, and, you know, they famously got there before us. So then we did everything we could to theoretically land on the moon and come back. And, I mean, it was something crazy, like 6% of the GDP or some large number anyway. Yeah. And so now it gets privatized, and there are more countries, not a lot, but there are more countries. But there are problems because like Planet Labs starts putting thousands of these satellites. To now, governments are putting people into camps because of our information and finding nukes and all this stuff, unforeseen. But now, it's sort of like WALL-E or whatever. Like you can't get out. Space becomes dangerous because there's so many of these. So talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing you're talking about it's called the Kessler effect or Kessler syndrome.
We're talking about space debris. We're talking about mostly anthropogenic or human-made pieces of debris. So these are defunct satellites, rocket bodies that have been expended and left up in orbit. There are about 40,000 objects that we're tracking right now on orbit.
You know, the way this used to work was a satellite cost $1 or $2 billion to make. It was supposed to stay up in space for 20 years, right. and they were precious and few. In the last 3 years, that's gone from 2,200 to this year will probably end at like 12 or 13,000. So, you know, we're on this exponential curve now. And Planet was the company that proved instead of doing those big one-offs, we'll do hundreds and spread this kind of load and bring them much closer to Earth.
Our constellation of nearly 200 Earth observation satellites currently orbiting Earth is the largest ever.
So yeah, no, I mean, you're right. You know, they proved intellectually what was possible, and now it comes with this huge cost.
And then all of a sudden, these tiny little companies become multi-billion-dollar companies, and you see the importance of it, and the NASA contracts are huge, and they become multi-billion-dollar companies, and they're successful, and the rockets are great, and the satellites are great. And then they go, yeah, we're nothing compared to SpaceX and Starlink.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. Oh, I have many thoughts. I mean, SpaceX it's about 25 years old this year. And if you go back 25 years ago, like the U.S. space program is in a pretty depressing state. You know, you were heading to the space shuttle being retired. NASA didn't really have any sort of replacement to put anything in space on its own, let alone humans. Boeing and Lockheed sort of share ownership of this giant company called ULA that was like would send up our military satellites and other things for astronomical fees. and we were actually like dependent on the Russians for a lot of stuff. If you wanted to put a human on the space station, we needed the Russians. The Russians made the engines for Boeing and Lockheed's rockets. And so and China was about to start investing in all this stuff. So, you know, SpaceX comes along, totally unlikely story, it takes them about 15 years to really hit their stride. Yeah. And then it's one of those things, it moves slowly, then it moves quickly. And today, SpaceX laps the entire world many times over. So in a great year, if you went back 10 years ago, it would be a miracle if you put up one rocket a month. If you were Russia, China, the United States. SpaceX is launching just about every 2 days satellites, going from 2,000 to about 12,000. SpaceX is about 70% of that increase in satellites. So they become the biggest rocket and satellite company. But, you know, the flip side is like people would be freaking out right now because China has invested a ton in space.
China has launched an unprecedented mission to retrieve samples from the far side of the moon.
Now, China has successfully launched its youngest ever astronauts, or taikonauts, into space, where they'll spend the next 6 months on a station called Heavenly Palace. Beijing is aiming for a record year of lunar exploration, but the US is growing increasingly alarmed at the prospect of a new space race.
They would be way ahead.
They would win the space race.
Completely. So on this one level, I'm not terribly nationalistic or patriotic, but if you are, this is like a fantastic story. On the other one, it's so unlikely. Nobody ever thought this was happen or even possible, but SpaceX more or less has like a monopoly for the moment in space.
So if Planet Labs has that amount of data and knowledge, then it's you've got to think.
Yeah, I mean, you've got planets doing imaging, and SpaceX is mostly communications, as far as we know. But, you know, now SpaceX has become, the U.S. government, the Defense Department, is trying to build their own version of Starlink, but SpaceX is building it for them, and everyone knows that it's a communication satellite, but you don't really know what's on the satellite exactly. So
here's when you're going to realize how well thought out this interview is. Much like Bloomberg. It's two-way.
Exactly.
And you can spy if you want. I mean, and when it becomes the sort of, as you were saying, everyone's going to want a space internet. When it becomes the default of all information, because it's your emails, it's your banking, it's everything, it's on your phone, so it's everything. That's all going through Starlink satellites.
Yeah, I mean, it would become this kind of backbone of data. It's pretty fascinating, too. I mean, these satellites are, once you put them up, it's hard to know exactly what's going on with them or what they're, something that's a communication satellite might also be an
Much
imaging.
like a Bloomberg terminal.
And then strange things happen up there. People know about a Chinese satellite and it goes up, and then this little satellite comes out of it, and they can see on these trackers that we were talking about that it's going up by a American satellite, and it doesn't do anything as far as anyone tells us, but it's like letting everybody know that it could. And then there's a part we haven't even talked about, which is GPS runs in space, and it is like this glue that makes all of our phones, it makes the modern world, we totally take it for granted, but it makes your smartphones work, it makes like transportation work.
Wasn't it started by NORAD initially?
It was like a U.S. Defense Department, just like the internet technology that became this glue.
And now GPS does a lot of things that we don't even think about, but
I mean, it's like this clock that kind of makes the modern world like a fabric that makes everything hum along. Yeah.
It's also a bit terrifying, not to be dystopian, but to go back to GPS, it's where you go, what you spend your money on, and so it's all knowledge about everything that you do.
Yeah, like you can imagine if a war kicked off over somewhere like Taiwan or something like that. If you wipe out the GPS system, life's going to be pretty interesting very quickly, kind of for everyone. I mean, at that point, if you wanted to take the whole thing out, it would be this like, we can get through this better than you can kind of situation. The wild card, too, and all this, I think, we were talking about SpaceX, which, yes, is dominant, and there's stuff we can get into in Ukraine. But Russia is the ultimate wild card of this. You got a country that I don't think people maybe fully appreciate. Space is not just like a point of national pride. When you go back to the early Soviet days, this idea of expanding through the universe, pushing human intelligence out beyond our planet, it was actually like this kind of fundamental goal of the Soviet lifestyle and experience. And so the space program is like deeply wound in their philosophy. They're in shambles, right? They have SpaceX has obliterated their business. The war in Ukraine has cut off most of their customers, and so you have
and sucked up a lot of the money,
right? And then they don't have the next thing. So the U.S. and China. U.S. is ahead, and China's close. They've gotten so far ahead of Europe, Russia, Japan. I just really see a situation where Russia can tell they're not going to play in this next era other than to be the wild card and make things maybe interesting. So like if Russia wanted to build a space internet today, it really probably couldn't do it. Yeah.
They're an interesting country in that sense because they can do things that are very cheap and sort of mechanic, like, famously, you had to change the gears in a Russian tank with a wrench.
Yeah.
But they beat the Nazis because they would they would make so many of them. But then Glasnost and Perestroika, we sort of bankrupted them with the threat of Star Wars.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Here, an artist's projection of the president's vision.
Banning into space, a layered defense to protect the country from nuclear devastation.
And Russia said, we can't compete. And then so that eventually led to the opening up of the Soviet Union to modern-day Russia, which is quite interesting.
You know who ran Star Wars? Pete Warden.
Really?
Yeah, he was the chief technology officer.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
He's had a plan.
Yeah, well, it worked. You brought it up that we can talk about the Ukraine, for example, with Starlink or Planet Labs or the new space sort of information? Like, what are some of the things that we saw happen in reality?
There's a couple. Well, there's a lot of fascinating elements. One is in my book about this, I make the case that I think in those early days of the war, look, who knows what actually would have happened, but I think with Planet plus Starlink, I think this is what let Ukraine survive that first week of the war. Look for all the world, like Russia was about to march right to Kyiv, and that could have been it, right? Very quickly. But what we saw was morale busting on some ways. We saw the Russian tanks stalled on these long convoys, and we had images of them pasted up all over the world. And then as the Russians went in to try to take out Ukraine's communications network, they didn't know that it had been backstopped by thousands of Starlink terminals in the months before the war broke out. And Ukraine's been relying on this communications network ever since. And not only does it let you do the basics, but that's what's letting all the drones fly, everything, right? So
weapons need GPS and all this.
Exactly, right, this communication. And to me, I argue this is the first space war where and it was not governments that did this, it was commercial companies that laid all this infrastructure.
Crazy.
So without that, I think Ukraine would be in a lot of trouble. As time has gone on, much has been written about Elon periodically turning Starlink off. He says he doesn't want it to be in places where somebody's like an active war zone, although it's very hard to draw this
But didn't
line.
allegedly Putin call him and say, hey?
This is what people say. Starlink has been such a part of this war for so long. I find it slightly amusing that people kind of fixate on this one point because I'm not even sure it matters in the big picture. The U.S. government since the 1960s has wanted to build a military, a space internet for exactly this reason. They could never get their act together to actually do it. Pete Warden, the same guy going way back, DARPA was investigating this idea of can we do this? They found out Boeing and Lockheed couldn't do it, right? Yeah. And so this guy comes along, does it, and then now it's so it's like, where do you follow this? If this thing didn't exist, Ukraine would be screwed. Now it exists, you're in trouble because he has the on-off switch. I've seen these situations where the U.S. generals can't bring themselves to kind of have a real conversation with Elon because they feel like they're subservient to him on this stuff, and they really have put themselves in a position where they are. And so there's many different ways you can slice this. I don't know. I remember a weekend where Elon, he was upset that the U.S. government wasn't paying for Starlink in Ukraine, and he turned it off. And I was texting with him, and it's like, I think we should turn this on. This is crazy, and it comes on a few hours later. I'm sure he was getting pressure from a lot of sides, but it's a crazy world where you have this one guy who can decide these things now.
It's wild, and the whole story is wild, and the speed with which everything has changed, which you sort of capture. Basically, it's the length of your documentary is how fast it happened.
Yeah, it's nuts because it's like people thought there's so many failures. People thought this would happen sooner, and they've been trying to do it for decades, and all this money got lost, and then all of a sudden it just works. And,
boom.
And you've got
that changes everything.
It's crazy, right? To have one guy, one company, where the president and the Defense Department have to come beg to.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to bring up, which is, you have to give it to him. One guy did more than NASA. And pretty big. Also, I've heard stories where they're like, okay, we want SpaceX to do this. It's going to be $2.5 billion. Yeah, I'll do it for $20 million or $250 million or 10% or whatever. And they're like, no, we want it to be $2.5 billion. He's like, well, it's not going to cost which is theoretically where the Doge thing came from. Is we don't have to do it, and the generals want to spend that money, or their budgets go down, or what have you.
There's lots of examples through. NASA's in some ways a great organization that has been for decades. In a lot of other ways, it's way past its sort of time and
due date. Yeah. So one of the things, and literally, I just looked at the questions now. I don't know how long we've been going, but who controls space, A. B, what laws govern. There's a sort of touch on it in the film, but I find that fascinating as well. And where do you see it going forward as technology comes online?
The laws today are pretty loose. If you're talking about the United States and like most spacefaring nations, there usually is a pretty decent regulatory body that makes sure the actual rocket part is safe and you're not just firing rockets off all the time. Although you can hop on X and other social media accounts and see a wayward Chinese rocket going over cities sometimes. But that in the United States, for example, that would be the strictest part. You can't just think you
willy-nilly
can launch a rocket. There's a lot of people who are making sure before you fire it. Once you get to space, there's almost no regulation. As far as I know, New Zealand is the only country that says, like, you are very responsible for the satellite you've put up in space, and a lot of these come back to Earth and deorbit, that you need to do this, and they put some responsibility on people. Everyone else, it's a little, once it's up there, you kind of, if you stake out the territory and you get there first, and this is what SpaceX has done, because they've been in a lot of regulatory battles over, are these satellites safe? Are you interfering with our things? They've just been launching them so much faster than everyone else that it's almost impossible to keep up.
Do you think we're going to look back? I think we're going to look back, let's say in 20 years, and say unregulated social media was insane.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to say unregulated space it was going to be crazy too.
I don't know. I get torn on this one. The stakes are so high because these companies have spent so much money, and the Kessler syndrome that we were talking about, like, everybody loses in that. So you are very incented to make sure that doesn't happen if you've gone this far. I think this is basically going to be a 2-horse race between the United States and China from here on out.
Especially with quantum.
And there's not just new types of computing that will take place in space. There's manufacturing. There's all kinds of asteroid mining. Which sounds, I thought, was insane. People are actually already doing prototype tests now. So much money. Each asteroid is like $1 trillion. Yeah. So all this stuff that sounded fantastical and BS is now actually like entering the realm of possibility. So if you're nationalistic, if the U.S. is your thing, you're actually in pretty good shape. We have more rocket companies and satellite companies than anywhere on Earth. Yeah. China's kind of sort of playing catch up, but is actually putting more money in. Right. The rest of the countries, it looks bad. Europe pretty much laughed SpaceX off as never going to happen, and now they're probably 20 years behind.
The United States has been tracking Russia's development of a nuclear-capable anti-satellite weapon in space.
When you have this tremendous power and this tremendous information, and somebody goes, well, I want that, but I can't do it. But I do have these nukes.
That's what I mean. I think Russia's reaction to this could be, if you see the world advancing in this way and you can't participate, I just don't think Russia really stomachs that.
Outrage from U.S. officials after Russia carried out a missile test, firing an anti-satellite missile into space, obliterating one of its own satellites and creating a vast debris field that's now orbiting Earth.
In November 2021, Russia launched a missile at one of their own old, defunct spy satellites. They smashed it into smithereens, caused thousands of pieces of debris, and this happened not too far along the orbital arc from where the astronauts on the space station were. And so they were not too happy about that.
Dr. Jonathan McDowell, I'm very excited about this. You're an astronomer, an astrophysicist, and space historian. I love this first one because you're an astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge. That's a big triple whammy of a name.
Yes, it is. We are probably the biggest astronomy research group in the world. We like to think we're at the cutting edge, doing everything from asteroids and satellites to the Big Bang. And we're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not the real Cambridge. I studied back at the real Cambridge back in the day, but Cambridge, Massachusetts is still a pretty awesome place to be working.
Let's get into it right away. How quickly are satellites expanding?
It's amazing. There's been transformational change in just the past 5 years. 5 years ago, there were 1,000 working satellites, which was already a huge amount more than in what most people think of as the heyday of the space age with the moon landings and so on, where there were only maybe 100 satellites. But in just 5 years, we've gone from 1,000 working satellites to 10,000 working satellites.
10x.
And there are predictions that we'll reach 100,000 in another 10 years. Concomitant with that, there's a couple of things, right? One is that maybe 10 years ago at least, most space was government. There was commercial space, but it wasn't that huge. And now space is by far dominated by commercial actors, not just in the US, but in Europe and also in China. And so it's not just also the number of satellites that's gone up, it's the number of players. There's like all of these startups springing up, launching satellites. The bar to entry has been lowered so much that anyone can get some venture capital and come launch a few satellites. And so it's getting really complicated up there.
I want to talk for a little bit about the importance of satellites because, a lot of people don't think about them. So maybe just remind us, why satellites are so important and how much of the sort of fabric of our modern civilization is fueled by these things.
Right. So much of what we do has space hidden behind it and you don't even realize. I mean, I think most people know that when they use GPS, they're using space. They're using satellites in space to find their way home. So people appreciate how we're dependent on that these days because no one remembers how to read a map.
Sure.
But, also Internet of Things devices, all the weather forecasting, of course, from satellites, ATM transactions being, checked by the home bank over a satellite link. So much of what we do in this interconnected, self-monitoring, everything knows where it is and what it's doing world is invisibly using space as the backbone for connecting. But there are a lot of potential problems with the privacy when satellites can, monitor what everyone is doing. The society has to discuss and go, all right, what's the right way to handle this? But yeah, news organizations, for example, anyone who's followed the war in Ukraine, right, knows the satellite pictures showing, well, what did this attack work? Or, what's the situation in this area?
These are the latest satellite images that in fact show a large deployment of forces in southern Belarus.
It's amazing now what the public can see that 50 years ago, only the spies could see.
Maybe talk through some of the geopolitical and intelligence ramifications that we face with this newfound plethora of images.
The good news, is that we can no longer have countries going, well, I'm doing this when they're really doing that. That we can look and we can go, well, no, actually, we see what you're doing, and it's really this. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's healthy. In general, the history of spy satellites in the Cold War was actually very good in the sense that both sides were fearful of what the other was doing, and when they knew exactly what the other was actually doing, they were able to not overreact, right? So instead of building 10,000 missiles, we only built 1,000 missiles, which was still a lot, but it could have been worse. And so I think the feeling historically has been that this sort of open information actually can help reduce tensions because often people are more paranoid than the reality. So when they see the reality, it's actually better. But yeah, maybe Ukrainians don't want the Russians knowing where their troops are sneaking off to.
Right.
So there's a real conversation to be had about that lack of privacy at everything from the personal to the strategic level.
Yeah, speaking of the Ukraine, there was a lot made of, Starlink, which are satellites, were put in there, and they were using them, I guess, to target weapons and to do all kinds of different things. And supposedly there was a call with Putin, and then Starlink went out. These things take on a massive sort of geopolitical power, and the more there are and the more that they do, for example, if they're providing your internet and they shut off your internet through cable, then you can only get it through satellites, then what do you do?
Well, that's right. And so the question is, who makes those decisions, right? How do we regulate the use of satellites? Is it up to the satellite company to decide who gets service, who gets the information, or are they required to provide information by their host governments in certain ways? Again, there are pros and cons of all these approaches. In an ideal world, you have sort of enough competition that there's 4 or 5 choices and no one person can cut you off. But in practice, there's just a few. This is so expensive, these space missions, you end up coming down to just 1 or 2 providers. And so they have a lot of power and a lot of control over the information that we get and the information that people get about us.
There's a combination of things happening of targeting satellites. If we have an enemy, for example, we can sort of target your satellite and knock it out. Or satellites accidentally, because there's so many of them now, hitting each other, which creates debris, but you have debris going at incredibly fast speeds, which you can tell me as an astrophysicist, and there's now going to be a lot more debris around, which causes problems for other satellites, and it causes problems to get above that low Earth orbit. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the problems caused by so many satellites and potentially A, accidents happening, or B, non-accidents, so targeted attacks.
Right. So, so we're now in this era, right, where there is so much space activity that we are starting to have an environmental impact on outer space in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the important ways that that's happening is just the sheer amount of traffic in space is making it difficult for satellites to avoid hitting each other. And so to be in orbit, physics says that you have to be going in low orbit at about 17,000 miles an hour. And so if you imagine this environment where thousands of satellites are traveling at 17,000 miles an hour in 3 dimensions in all directions, there are going to be close misses and sometimes hits. In 2009, 2 big satellites hit each other and caused thousands of pieces of debris that mostly are still in orbit, right? The debris doesn't just fall down when a satellite is destroyed. In 2007, China fired a missile at one of its satellites just to demonstrate their muscle and blew that into 3,000 pieces.
China succeeded in shooting down one of its own aging weather satellites with a medium-range ballistic missile fired from the ground. It was reduced to hundreds of pieces of space debris,
most of which are still orbiting the Earth today. And each one gets a little catalog number. This is, the 2,180th fragment of this Chinese weather satellite, and it's still orbiting around in this orbit. And so all the time now, satellite operators have to dodge. They get like a day's warning to go, we've calculated your orbit out through tomorrow. Looks like you're going to come really close to this piece of space junk. You might want to move. And eventually there's going to be so much stuff up there, both through accidents like collisions, through rocket stages with leftover fuel that just blow up a few years later because they have the leftover fuel in them, or through military tests like the Russian anti-satellite test in November of 2021, which caused a big international ruckus.
The Russian Federation recklessly conducted a destructive satellite test of a direct ascent anti-satellite missile against one of its own satellites. The test has so far generated over 1,500 pieces of trackable orbitable debris and hundreds of thousands of pieces of smaller debris.
And so all of these things are, just making the environment harder and harder to operate in. And there is a real risk of a runaway chain reaction where debris from collisions causes other collisions that causes more debris. And we could get into a situation where it's very difficult to operate in space because of all the shrapnel flying around.
Is that what's known as the Kessler effect?
That's right. So Don Kessler in the 1970s predicted this when there was much less space traffic around. And so that's been known as the Kessler cascade or the Kessler effect. It's not like in the movies where when you have one collision and then 10 minutes later, all of space is unusable. It unrolls like most bad environmental effects, right? It unrolls very slowly over decades. Every year is just a little worse than the previous year. until you get to the point where, you really can't operate because you're getting hit by debris all the time.
So you have all this debris going, and again, it's 17,000 miles an hour. It's a bullet. Like, so if it's a bolt or a thing or a piece of shrapnel, it can go through a space station. It can go through. It's like firing a bullet at something. Now, what happens if we want to go to the moon or go to Mars or go to these places? Eventually, if there's too much debris, you won't be able to get out of orbit.
That's exactly right. And even now, right, when you're launching a rocket, sometimes there's like a little pause in the countdown. Oh, we have to avoid this 5-second period because there's going to be like space debris in our way if we do.
Right.
And so those problems are going to become just more and more frequent until you're trying to find the moment where you can dodge the debris to get out. And so, we're I don't want to over exaggerate, it's not, we're not there yet. But you could imagine a time where things go that bad.
Is there a new space race? And if there is, who's racing?
I'm not a huge fan of casting it as a space race because I think now most countries are involved in space, for their own agendas, not just to beat X. And so, for example, China is going to send astronauts to the moon, not in a race with America exactly, but because they feel that's the next logical thing for their program to do. And yet a lot of people in America are construing it as a race and going, well, it matters which of us gets there first.
Or second.
Or second, right, exactly.
You made a slip there.
Yeah. And so that's right. I mean, we were in the moon in 1969, of course, but we need to go back, right? That's the plan that NASA has.
Yeah.
And it's embarrassing if before we get back, China gets there.
Why? Who cares?
Well, I agree. I mean, apparently people care. And what matters, though, so the plan is to build a base on the moon near the south pole of the moon, which is a small area of the moon where there may be useful resources like frozen water. And if China establishes a big base there and takes, all of the good land, right, there is actually a bit of a race towards who gets the good land. So it's not a question of, did I land first the first time, but did I develop this area of the moon before the U.S. got its piece?
Squatters' rights.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a bit of a race in that sense. And there's economic competition more broadly, I would say.
While we're on that, so we talk about China getting there before us. We talk about commercial companies versus state. What are some of the laws that govern space? Are there laws that govern space?
Absolutely. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them there's a whole academic discipline of space lawyers.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of friends who are space lawyers, and they do a whole bunch of different things. And the core law of the universe is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The key point of that treaty was no weapons of mass destruction. Don't take your atom bombs into space.
Yeah.
But they had a lot of other things as well, like give due regard to the activities of other countries. Let's share alike. You can't. No national appropriation. Sticking your American flag on the moon doesn't make it American territory, right? You can't nationally acquire a celestial body.
We're talking about politics and the laws that govern space. Star Wars. Now, I know it wasn't a nuke in space, but it was theoretically a laser that could shoot down nukes.
Right. Weapons are okay as long as they're not weapons of mass destruction. Okay. I mean, I don't think they're okay personally, but
right.
There is no international law against weapons in space, although there is against weapons on the moon.
Oh, okay.
You can't do military activity on the moon, but you can do it in orbit. So the anti-satellite weapons are good. I think that was partly because they realized that intercontinental ballistic missiles go through space on the way to hitting their targets. And
right.
So the other thing that they did was they said that every activity in space has to be supervised by a nation state, by a launching state, they called it. And so that was easy in those days because all the satellites were American government or Soviet government, right? Or a few exceptions. But now we have all this commercial activity that wasn't really envisaged at the time. And so what that means is when If SpaceX, an American company, like crashes into, say, a French satellite, they are owned by a French commercial company, say Airbus. It's not between SpaceX and Airbus to resolve it. It goes up to the host countries, and it's between the US and France to resolve it. It automatically becomes an international incident.
I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
What is the Space Force? Because a lot of people, you hear about it, but you don't know what the hell it is.
It used to be that the Air Force had a whole chunk of the Air Force dedicated to space stuff, by which we mean operating the GPS satellites, launching spy satellites, operating military weather satellites, military communication satellites. So it's not like Space Marines for the most part. Space has become so important that it made sense to separate out that bit of the Air Force. And so most of Space Force is launching rockets, operating satellites. It's people sitting in mission control centers, joysticking satellites and stuff like that. It's not to do with weapons or fighter spaceships or something like that a lot of people might imagine.
So let's extrapolate. Let's say in the next 10 years, starting from today, what do you think the most positive change will be because of all of this, incredible, evolution? And what will be, do you think, the scariest part of that evolution? So positive and negative. Next 10 years, space.
The positive thing is that I do think it's good that the world is getting more interconnected. And I think 10 years from now, even in remote areas, in developing countries, there will be internet broadband. Everyone will have access to information, and that's a good thing. And we will have better, hurricane warnings, better warnings about natural disasters, which is good because we're going to have more natural disasters because of climate change. So improving the warnings is needed. The flip side, as we mentioned, is less privacy. Privacy can be a good thing, and we're going to be in this sort of big brother world where the state knows everything that's going on and where you are and what you had for lunch, and satellites are only part of that. The internet is another big part of it, but they connect in to this sort of interconnectedness that brings us together, but also potentially controls us. Those are big challenges that society is going to have to face and decide how do we carve out some limitations, some control over how these technologies are used so that they don't become oppressive.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. With satellites, you can track movements, and with banks, you can, where you spend your money, how you spend your money. It's privacy for everything.
Right. And of course, I'm like everyone else. I see these, do I accept this cookie or whatever? And I go, oh, sure, just let me through and use the site, right? Because I want my stuff. And so I'm, I'm guilty in my own privacy demise in that way. So we as humans have decided that screw privacy, we want to have all the cool stuff.
Screw privacy, we want Mars.
But also we want our Amazon delivery, and our Instacart delivery. And I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm saying that's the way that we seem to be going.
Well, the space business is expected to grow in the coming years, and private space travel is just the beginning.
There's no shortage of hype surrounding the commercial space industry.
Delianne Asparohoff, how are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me, sir.
I'm going to get into who the hell you are, bona fides here. You're a principal at Khosla Ventures.
Was. Now partner at Founders Fund.
The Founders Fund.
The Founders Fund.
Wow. So
Mr. Peter Thiel.
You're a rich guy now then.
Working on it.
There you go.
We all are.
And Varda, which I want to talk about today, Varda Space Industries.
Making the best drugs off this planet.
Okay, want to talk about that. You attended MIT.
Briefly. Whether I got booted or dropped out is a matter of mystery.
On the special academic package.
Exactly. Turns out if you impersonate the president in an email to the entire campus, people get unhappy.
Is that what you did?
Why?
Why?
I was drunk.
Yeah.
It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I wanted to prove a point to a frat brother, and
prove a point that you could impersonate the president.
Yeah, he didn't believe that I could. And I could.
The president of the United States or the president of
President of MIT. I think president of the U.S. would have been even better, worse,
Harder.
but yeah, and harder.
And how did you do it?
6 lines of PHP. Pretty
Done.
simple code. Didn't take
Boring.
much. Pretty boring. And then you get
You're
arrested.
a coder.
Yes, I like to dabble in the coding, mostly when I do naughty things. But
Okay, we're fascinated by space, not the
Me
final
too.
frontier, as in what people think about space, or maybe they do think this about space. But I guess my recent fascination comes from Wild Wild Space, which I think is just a phenomenal primer on what's happening up there. The companies are sort of a good entree to sort of say, oh, there's capitalism involved, et cetera. And then the knowledge that you get, from being in space, and the fact that it's, going to be all things pretty soon. And if Elon gets his way with Starlink, all information, GPS, everything will be going through, all information going through his satellites, which is interesting. You have a different thing, which I want to talk about, and you actually alluded to it already. You've already given away the hook.
The hook.
Which is the best drugs made in space.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
when I looked you up, one of the things says it can only be manufactured in space. What the hell does that mean? Go.
Our original idea, people have been, sort of theorizing about this now, even for sort of 60 plus years. There was a paper in the mid 1950s talking about, hey, up there in space, when we get up there one day, there's not going to be any gravity, and that's going to fundamentally change how everything works. Like when you think about all chemical engineering, material science is done here on the ground, one of the things that's just considered a constant is just like the gravitational level, right? The fact that when I, pick up this glass of water, it's going to fall back down. The fact that this, sort of water stays in this cup, it's entirely due to gravity. And so everything around how we think about manufacturing semiconductors, pharmaceutical manufacturing, everything just takes into account that gravity is basically, sort of always there. But it's kind of arbitrary. It's just based off of the sort of mass of the Earth. And the moment that you basically go into orbit, it's not to say that you're not experiencing gravity. It's just that you're spinning around fast enough, just like you're on the end of a lasso, such that basically the centrifugal force and the gravitational force cancels each other out perfectly. And that's both what keeps sort of Elon Musk's Starlink satellites up there, but it's also what we're sort of looking to utilize sort of up there. And so why does it matter going up there? Why does microgravity sort of change things and allow you to make better drugs? I think it's always helpful to start off with a little bit of a sort of higher level and sort of simpler analogy.
Yeah.
If you gave me an ice cube right now, if I really wanted to keep my water a little cold, and I dropped that ice cube in this glass of water that's in front of me, very intuitively what would happen? It would sort of sink down a little bit, and then it would float to the top. Why does that ice cube float to the top of the glass of water that I currently have? Well, water, when it's in that solid form of ice, those water molecules are ever so slightly further apart from one another than they are when it's a liquid. And so that ice, if you look at it on a sort of volume basis, is actually slightly less dense, basically, than the water that's around it. And so when you're inside of a gravitational field, basically lighter things will move upwards, heavier things will move, sort of downwards. It's this process known as sedimentation, right? The sort of opposite effect would be if you gave me an ice cube full of salt and I were to drop it into here, that salt would all fall down to the bottom versus the ice cube will sort of float to the top. Now let's pretend you and I...
In Hercule Poirot mysteries, it's always cyanide that floats to the bottom.
It's true. Cyanide will also float down to the bottom.
I know my stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But
Keep going.
I'd prefer
Drugs
to drink
in
some
space.
salt. But let's pretend you and I are up on the International Space Station at, or some future private space station. You set up your green room, up there in the studio, and we're doing a podcast.
Yeah.
And you hand me that same ice cube and that same, basically ice cube full of salt. What happens? You drop the ice cube in, but there's no up, there's no down, right? The whole concept of up and down is based off of gravity. And so instead, that ice cube is just going to float in the middle of the water rather than being, sort of moved around. And so basically when you turn off gravity, you're turning off some of those gravity-related forces, or transport is what it's called. So things that are known as sedimentation, convection, buoyancy, all of those are basically fully shut down. And so it just changes how chemical reactions function at a very fundamental level. Let's say you had some, sort of drug where the only way to make it was you needed oil and vinegar to be perfectly mixed in a chamber and stay that way without anybody disturbing it.
That's how the French make vinaigrette.
It's true. On Earth, though, you kind of need to be constantly stirring it. Otherwise, the oil and the vinegar basically separate from one another. So that's why when you have a packet of vinaigrette, you shake it up first before you pour it. In space, you don't got to shake it up, because the moment that it's shaken up and mixed together, it will stay at that perfect homogeneous basically mixture rather than separating into
But if
the
you bring
lighter
it
and heavier
back, it's
components.
problematic, no?
So we only work on compounds that what you're doing up there is taking it from the liquid form into a solid form, so a crystal. And that crystal has unique properties where imagine it was that oil and vinaigrette, but we basically froze it. And so now we have like this like vinaigrette ice cube basically, and we're bringing it back down. There are drugs where you can't basically get them frozen into that homogeneous, perfectly mixed form down here on Earth. But what you can do is you can take the precursors up to space, freeze them together in this like homogeneous, basically even mixture, bring it back down, and as long as you don't melt it, you get all the benefits of that basically microgravity mixture, but down here on Earth. And so that sort of
seems not very cost effective. A and B. Why drugs? Why not like you when you said microprocessor or something? You would think like, oh, with AI chips and everything going through the roof, and Lord help NVIDIA's earnings tomorrow, but you could build some kind of crazy chip that no one had thought about.
If you look at just like all of the, let's say, exquisite, expensive chemical systems on the planet, the active pharmaceutical ingredients in drugs are like 1,000 to 10,000 times more expensive per unit mass. And so if you think about like mass being the like limiting factor, drugs are these ways. So that's like the high level. And then the like the reason that it's not just abstract is also like in 2019, Merck showed this. Like everything that I'm theorizing about, they took their blockbuster, basically antibody drug. It's this cancer drug known as Keytruda. Last year for them, it did $25 billion in revenue. Financial analysts estimate it represents a third of Merck's market cap. So like $125 billion is just this one drug. They basically showed, they took it up there. They basically did exactly what I just said. They mixed things together.
Where?
They froze it up on the ISS.
Right.
So this was Q1 2019.
So they sent up their chemicals.
Exactly, like precursor, basically.
Yeah, just to prove that they could do it.
Prove that they could do it, and the result looked phenomenal.
Phenomenal.
Like clearly something, and the reason that it matters for you and I as a patient is, let's say that less homogeneous version that they get on the ground, when it's less homogeneous, it basically breaks down in our bloodstream in a very irregular way. And so we can't just, send patients home with basically like a syringe. It is requires basically patients coming into a clinic, having an IV drip, but also constantly monitoring the dosing so that you can basically adjust the flow rate on the IV to make sure the patient's dosed appropriately. What they showed on the ISS is you can take that same $25 billion a year drug, and now all these cancer patients, you can just send them home basically with a syringe.
Wow.
And so I saw this result in 2019. I saw Falcon 9 rockets starting to, sort of take off and be reused. To me, it was just like, okay,
I'm there.
Clearly, somebody needs to bring this to market. I originally approached it as an investor. You said I was a partner at Founders Fund. My original thinking was like, let me find somebody to give them $10 billion and sort of go do this. Everybody shot me down. The like pharmaceutical guys were like, I don't know how to make spacecraft. The spacecraft guys were like, I don't really understand this drug stuff. People on the ISS were like, we like the ISS and doing small scale research. Our job is not to translate things, out into the clinic and out into patients. And so I originally kind of gave up after like 6 months. And then COVID hit, and, Peter Thiel, our CEO at Founders Fund, kind of told us to take a little break on, investing. And so I had a lot more free time. And I was like, man, I think this idea is like really, really good. People keep like shooting me down, but for reasons that like I don't totally buy. I think I can just go do this, but like I'm not I'm a electrical engineer, I'm a computer scientist. I'm not a spacecraft engineer, but I kind of sketched out on a napkin like I think this is kind of what you need: a small spacecraft, a little reentry pod with a drug reactor on board. I'm like, I don't know how to make any of these, but like I think it's doable. And then thankfully I had a bunch of buddies from MIT that had gone to SpaceX, and I just like threw the napkin by them, and I was like, is this something that we can make not with like $1 billion, but like tens of millions of dollars and even less over time? And they were all like, yeah, if you think this business case closes. And I was like, I think it does. Let's go do this. And so, that was sort of the answer on both, why the pharmaceuticals make sense, but then also.
And how far along are you on sort of doing it?
So we sent our first basically space factory up into orbit in June of 2023.
Stop. What is your space factory?
So our space factory is a satellite that's about the size of the table that's in front of us. In total.
It's not manned.
Fully unmanned. And, if you look at the way these drugs are made on the ground, it's not individual chemists pipetting stuff, and it hasn't been for like 20 years. It's, little robots anyways. The robots are just lab equipment. Right. So we basically send lab equipment inside of a sort of satellite, plus it's got a little reentry pod because unlike, Starlink, they don't have to send anything down. They just, they beam down their internet. Can't beam down drugs. Got to actually like physically, sort of bring them back down. So we have these reentry pods that hold the drugs.
Bring them back down frozen.
I got to bring them down frozen. So this, the important thing is the outside of the reentry pod gets hotter than the temperature of the surface of the sun. The inside of the reentry pod better stay below room temperature. Otherwise, what was the point of sort of going up there? So we sent the first one up in June of 2023. Our goal was to bring it back in August. A variety of various actors within the government thought we weren't ready to bring it down and told us we couldn't. And told us our space factory is going to be stuck up there for a very, very long time.
Wow.
We worked very hard with many people in the government that supported us to perhaps counteract some of the antigens, but that took some time. So our first space factory got stuck up there for about 8 months. So drugs were ready, space factory was done, the pod was ready to come down.
And why?
It's not so dissimilar than what SpaceX went through in the early days of sort of their launch. If people might not know this, but in the very early days, before they were actually allowed to launch from the United States, they actually had to go out to this random island in the middle of the Pacific to do some of their first sort of launches.
Because they're worried about re-entry.
They're worried about like if the rocket basically sort of blows up or
Yeah,
something like that. There's sort of population around there. We were trying to do this on a shoestring budget, and so we could have maybe done a first demo where we ditch this thing in the ocean, but we couldn't afford to really sort of do that. We kind of wanted to make it.
You lose the drugs.
You lose the drugs, yeah.
And the pod.
Exactly, and the pod, and so it wasn't really a real proof point. So we really wanted to land it on land. A commercial re-entry pod from space landing on land in the United States had never been done before.
Wow.
And so people just didn't really know how to think about it. The FAA, had written regulations about it, but we were the first to ever go through it. The military is the only body in the United States that owns a large enough piece of very empty land that we could go land at without risking, anybody's sort of life.
And how does it land? Like not with rockets, with a parachute, or?
So basically, you use rockets to get up to space to go very, very fast. But once you're up there, you could use a rocket to slow you down, but that's very expensive. It's a hell of a lot easier to basically just use a little tiny rocket that just slows you down just enough so you start intersecting the atmosphere, and you actually use the atmosphere basically as like an aero brake to basically slow you down. So we basically literally just have a thing that looks like a shuttlecock from badminton is kind of how you think about it. You can sort of knock it up into the air, and no matter what, it's kind of heavy at the bottom, and it goes basically sort of nose down. And so we actually published like a YouTube video from like when it separates from the satellite to about 25 minutes later when it's on the ground. It's kind of a sort of, I don't know, spiritual thing to watch, where it's just like it kind of reminds you like 25 minutes from space to the ground. It's like that's actually like way shorter than from like LA to San Francisco. Like space is a lot closer than you can sort of really appreciate.
How many shuttlecocks are there on the thing?
So the first one just had one. Over time, we'll definitely start to like make bigger factories that have multiple shuttlecocks. But yes, we eventually brought it down 1 year and 4 days ago. That was a very stressful time period, getting it back down. And because each day that you're up there, you're just risking like some solar flare, some satellite debris, something going wrong, right? And that was our only, sort of factory that we'd ever sent up. Thankfully, we now have a second one that's, sort of up there. On that first one, we did make some pharmaceutical drugs.
And can you do it by remote control, or do you do it by like pre-programmed, or
more remote control? So think of it as like we have like in normal labs on the ground, the chemist doesn't always necessarily like literally walk out to the lab equipment to go control it and tell it what to do. They'll sometimes program it from like their own computer, or maybe there's like a technician sort of there. So it's sort of the same thing. So what's kind of unique about Varda is like in our mission control, we have like the normal people that you'll see at other aerospace companies, mission control, head of GNC, flight dynamics, software, etc. But then we also have one operator desk that's staffed by a chemist.
Right.
And that chemist is communicating with the satellite basically and telling it, okay, mix the drugs, heat the drugs, do this. And we actually feed data back to the chemist on basically like how it's going. And over time, we're just expanding more and more capabilities basically in each, sort of drug, sort of factory as we go on. So that, Merck drug that I mentioned, Keytruda from that 2019 experiment, it's a more like complex drug that requires more specific handling and more complex processing equipment. So the first one that we sent up did not have that level of complexity, nor does this second one that we're sending up, but we're steadily basically on each mission expanding the scope, on like what that drug reactor on board is capable of to start to, manufacture the complexity of compounds that have been proven basically before in, sort of microgravity. And so, yeah, we got that second one up there right now. It'll actually be landing in about 6 days or so from today, perhaps, sort of less than that.
What happens to the factory after the shuttlecock leaves?
For now, we burn up the factory. So that's not the ideal long term. I think we want to step into reusability, similar to how SpaceX did it, sort of step by step, right? The shuttlecock, very easy to reuse because it already comes back down. You just send it up with the next factory. The factory, ideally, what it would do is right now, we have it bring the shuttlecock into the atmosphere, and then it just ditches the shuttlecock. The shuttlecock basically moves more quickly downwards because it's more aerodynamic, and the big solar panels on the factory basically slow it down, and it burns up behind the shuttlecock. Instead, what we would ideally do is actually have the factory come back out of the atmosphere, boost itself back up, and go back into orbit. And then ideally, we would actually just send shuttlecocks on the rocket.
Yeah.
And the shuttlecock would just have like the materials, a little bit of refueling, basically for the factories.
And could you do that? Could you send it up and it docks and then?
For sure. It definitely, like, to give you a sense, that would probably be like on the order of like $100 million, sort of project. So like, we definitely like don't want to do that yet today.
How much is a factory today?
Right now, the like total all-in factory is called like 7 million or so. This is where it's like it's probably better for us to like fly 10 disposable factories before we're investing into like the reusable one, just given the cost of each factory relative to the cost.
And
of
how much can you make on making the drugs up there per load?
So yeah, you sort of touched on this earlier, like how do the economics of this work? For the types of compounds that we're working on, this isn't like ibuprofen where it's like mass produced, mass consumed, sort of tons and tons of like the API. The thing that I like to sort of remind people is like when you take like your like gel capsule of ibuprofen, most of what you're taking is not actually ibuprofen. Most of it is that like gel that protects it so that it gets into your stomach. And then there's like inside a bunch of like liquid, what are known as like excipients that aren't the actual like ibuprofen drug. And inside there can be a very, very small amount of like basically kind of what looks like table salt that is the actual drug that you're taking.
Mm-hmm.
What we make up in space is not the gel capsule. It's not the like, liquid that's on the inside. Salt. It's just the salt. So if you look at that like sort of cancer drug, Keytruda that I mentioned, $25 billion in revenue in terms of what Merck makes off of it. For us to like mass produce that drug so that we could serve the entire patient population, it would be sending our current size shuttlecocks once every month or so. Wow. So it's not like we need like 10,000 of these mass production, et cetera. It's like just take the thing that we're doing this year 4 times and just do it 12 times. And so we can bring back about basically about 40 to 60, sort of kilos. And each individual patient dose of this drug is about like 100 milligrams. And so you definitely can actually bring back a significant amount of the dosing that's required. Right. Now, again, it's not going to be ibuprofen anytime soon, but like cancer drugs, neurological compounds, some of these like higher end things that are for more extreme, sort of scenarios, but that are still, sort of huge revenue opportunities. And then the goal is make it so that the factory is reusable, make it so that it's a little bigger, and you get all these sort of economies of scale and reusability. So now it's not just the super high-end drugs that we're, sort of improving up there. We can start to make, an example that I like to sometimes point out of like, why does that like homogeneous crystal structure matter? You'll have actually seen 2 different crystal structures when you've taken ibuprofen from a pharmacy. You've seen probably fast-release ibuprofen that's used for migraines versus slow-release ibuprofen that's used for arthritis. With both of those, it's actually the exact same drug, right? It's the same molecule. All that's different is how those crystal structures are basically shaped. And one makes it so that it releases really rapidly because you got a migraine, you got a headache, you want it done quick, versus arthritis, that one you want to, sort of release over the course of like 24 hours so it steadily, basically removes pain. So you could, in theory, basically make a version of ibuprofen, let's say, that rather than just being a 24-hour release for arthritis is like a 14-day release. And so now if you've got arthritis, you can just pop like 1 mega pill basically, once every 14 days, and it just like consistently, sort of doses you. And so, again, we're not going to work on that tomorrow, but it's like over time we can start to work on some of these more like mass market, applications. And it's not to say that like every drug is going to be made in space or anything like that, but like we actually think that like, a decade from today, if we've succeeded, that like on the order of like 15% of drugs, are made in space because, there's improvements that are, worthy of the sort of patients being willing to, pay a little more for it.
I have 2 questions. One is, what are some of the other things we can make in space that make it more efficient and or you can only make in space? And 2, I was talking to somebody about putting bases on the moon for mining and other reasons, but also that we're going to need staging areas to do stuff, to go, like, Elon talks about going to Mars, but just any kind of more interplanetary travel or interstellar travel, whatever you want to call it. You're going to need lots of stuff where you can get things that are already out there and then go, because we don't want to pull everything we need to go with us through the atmosphere.
I'm a big student of history, and so, it's maybe helpful to go back 600 years and, provide a historical, sort of analogy. In the sort of 16th century, at the beginning of it, there were 2 empires that sort of really discovered sort of naval technologies: the Chinese and the Portuguese. The Chinese Empire at the time took this approach of sort of one-off, extremely sort of large ships, and they would sail them to Africa on the behalf of the Chinese emperor, and they would go there and basically gather a lot of more ornamental, sort of, objects, they would gather tigers, elephants, and things like that, that, had no real economic value to the Chinese empire, let's say, but for the emperor, it could be something that he could show off.
I have
basically.
this and you don't.
Exactly. The Portuguese naval strategy was very different. They built these much smaller, basically merchant ships. They would fly sail them from the sort of coast of Portugal down to the African coast. They would establish an initial, basically merchant trading post, begin some trading and activity between Portugal and the northern coast of Africa. And then as that initial trading post basically became successful and there's lots of volume, the next set of merchant ships would move about basically 50 miles down the coast, and then establish another trading post, and they would just basically keep moving down until they had gone across the entire coast. Fast forward about sort of 75 years later, how did those two different sort of empires sort of play out? The Chinese emperor ended up deciding that this was a sort of waste of capital, and needed to focus inwards on his own citizens rather than just gathering these artifacts from Africa, and so actually basically shut down his sort of naval production. The Portuguese ended up basically becoming way larger than they were previously in Europe, and it was entirely because of this sort of naval empire. And so what was the Deltan approach? I see it as one that ultimately provided economic value back to the core empire, and that was what gave them these, let's say, extended trading posts that were forward operating bases, versus the Chinese, it provided no sort of economic sort of value back. So let's fast forward and think about, okay, how do we think about space as the equivalent of like the naval frontier? I could argue that the Apollo era was pretty similar to the Chinese empire. You sent out this great ship, you gathered a bunch of moon rocks, you had some awesome things you could say, I could do this, and you, Mr. Ruski, could not. But what ends up happening, we hit 1972, and all of a sudden we're in a war, and there's sort of crazy protests, and people are thinking that this is too much sort of government spending on a program that doesn't have economic return. The big ships get shut down, and we focus sort of inwards. I'd like to think that sort of Varda is the Portuguese sort of approach, in that what is that first sort of trading post that can be that forward operating base? To me, it's low Earth orbit. It's the thing that is closest to us. And that's why I've been obsessed with this idea around in space manufacturing since I was in like 5th or 6th grade. It was funny when the sort of first announcement for Varda came out. I had a friend from literally middle school that I hadn't seen since then that like texted me. He was like, wow, you finally started that idea that you used to talk about always back in the day. And I think it comes back to this just like, Bulgarian, sort of background that I've got that is just like so anti-communist, pro sort of capitalist sort of mindset. And when you like sort of analyze space, it felt like there was actually in some ways like a lack of sort of capitalism in it. And so I was always obsessed with this, again, analogy with the Portuguese, who's going to establish that first trading post. And it's important that trading post had real like industrial production, not just like beaming down internet and beaming down photos, because like that never felt like you're going to establish like a trading post where there's going to be a justification for people there and could be a forward operating base. Like no matter how big Starlink gets, there's never going to be like a base. Versus like if you look at our factories, as they get bigger and bigger, yes, they are fully automated today, but like the core one-liner mission of Varda and why I started it, it's to expand the economic bounds of humankind, right? And it's very important, that humankind portion. I'm not going to force humans into the equation today, but I know humans will be a part of the equation over the course of the next 5 to 7 years of our business. Because when those factories get large enough, even the most automated pharmaceutical factories on the ground still occasionally require a technician to come in and tune something up. And I just hope we can basically have technicians that are up there and we offer them a job that's similar to like a, guy that lives in Dallas and works out on an oil rig. You got 2 weeks on where you're out in the oil rig, this like, industrial piece of equipment in the middle of nowhere on the naval frontier. And then you get 2 weeks back in Dallas to be with your family and kids and everything and get paid a great salary. I'm hoping that there are people that, work at Varda that, sort of have a similar, sort of lifestyle and, pay, et cetera. It just happens to be that like our industrial rig is on the new frontier, the space frontier, but it's thought of as just like a normal job where you are up there, not for, being an astronaut or some super sexy, national thing. It's just like, yeah, I like, am responsible for the maintenance of these like pharmaceutical pieces, sort of equipment.
I love the Portugal versus China. As another student of history, you're forgetting two things, though. One is that China means heaven, and they did not want to go outside of China. Philosophically, they didn't want to ever leave it. And two is we didn't actually land on the moon. Okay, so let's get on with it.
I thought the other thing you were going to say is, by the way, the thing that fueled the Portuguese Empire was mostly the slave trade.
Yeah, well,
we'll ignore that part of it.
We're going to ignore that part. We'll say, going to Japan and samurais because that's what's on TV right now.
Exactly. Great TV show.
Okay, so space, the final frontier. What are some of the other so I love this idea. I love the idea of being Portuguese and saying, look, I have these bases, and before we need them, I'm going to set them up. So that when we do need them, guess what? I'm going to be there, and boom.
It's a hell of a lot easier to get to the moon when you've already got a forward operating base in low Earth orbit, and it's a hell of a lot easier to get to Mars when you've got both the moon and low Earth orbit before going to Mars.
Yeah, they're going to need to get out of orbit, stock up on all kinds of things, not just medicines, although a lot of medicines.
Exactly.
But like food or food-like substances.
Exactly.
And whatever, I don't know, water, I don't know. But what else can we make up there that we can't make down here? Because the reason why I say that is, these asteroids that have like a gajillion dollars, that's a technical term.
Totally.
Worth of rare earth minerals and crazy things that we don't have, and like stuff that we need more of. And the technology isn't that far off from, what's the movie where they do that? Armageddon.
Oh yeah, Armageddon. Yeah, exactly.
By the way, I have a thing where at high altitudes I fly a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but you get like more emotional than
Totally. A little hypoxia helps out.
Lots of oxygen. And I was watching a movie, blubbering like a baby, and it was Armageddon. Not one of the movies you'd think. It's not like Bambi or anything, but it's tattooed on my eyelids. but so that technology, now they're trying to blow it up, but we would mine the rare earth or rare minerals on these things. Tell me about that business.
Totally. You'll appreciate, by the way, my wife thinks it's very funny that the only movies I blubber at are space movies. It's the only thing that somehow gets me going inside and gets the waterworks. Yeah. There's a couple different things. I think it's always helpful to like provide some categories or buckets of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's stuff that you manufacture in space that's just to be used in space. So I'll talk a little about that.
Love it.
There's stuff that you manufacture in space
to bring back,
that you're bringing back to Earth. But
do
the
we
original.
Do we have terms for those? No.
Somebody should come up with it. Maybe I should, but I definitely think of it. Yeah, I'll start coming up with
lexicon.
names. Exactly. I'll come up with a lexicon. And that is stuff that comes from Earth and then comes back to Earth.
Yeah.
And then there's stuff that's for Earth but came from, basically outer space. So those are the three. So I'll provide a couple examples. In space, for space. Definitely, as you start to build bigger factories, it's going to start to make sense to honestly build the factories up there rather than right now we build the factories on the ground and send them up in sort of rockets.
Yeah.
And so maybe you would bring an asteroid in, and rather than sending that down to Earth, you'd mine that asteroid to build big factories, fuel, hotels up there, etc. And there's various groups that are working on this. There are people that now have these like 3D printers that use basically right now they're just using metals from Earth, but they look very similar to what metals from sort of asteroids could look like. And so there's some early projects going around that.
Plutonium or uranium or whatever it is.
Exactly. And there's on these asteroids, you have everything basically you need. It's the equivalent, if not even better than what you get in like the Earth's crust.
Yeah.
There's basically what Varda does, which is we take things from the ground and bring them, basically back down and make them better. There's definitely more than just, pharmaceutical drugs. Think of it as like any highly sensitive material science. It's like semiconductors. There's been some interesting proof point. High performance metal alloys. There's been some proof points. People have talked about basically tissues. So one of the things that makes basically printing a like heart on the ground difficult is the heart, once it's fully formed, can kind of stay together. But as you're printing it, it's all floppy because it's cells. And the problem is you have to make these like support structures on the ground, etc. But again, up there, no gravity, doesn't flop over. So you can basically like print a whole human heart is like one of the things that people have talked about.
That's the future. We print human hearts in space.
There's definitely people talking about that. There's also people talking about having pig farms that have human hearts inside the pigs. So maybe we're killing pigs, maybe we're making them in space, but either way, I think there will be a lot of artificially made hearts.
I want to make them in space.
I kind of like the pig idea too. It's a little cheaper is my bet, but but I like the space idea one too. And then the third is kind of what you mentioned, bring things basically back down, to Earth. There's a couple companies, even one that I believe is actually launching later this week, that is going to do the first ever basically commercial flyby of a, rare earth mineral asteroid to go, basically take a look at it.
Really? So I'm saying we're nearly there. We're there.
We're definitely, sort of getting pretty close. I would say, like, are they going to bring materials back next year? No, but like, I think, by the end of the decade, I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a couple groups at that point that have managed to bring some, sort of materials back. And by the way, everybody that needs to bring those materials back, they have to have some reentry pods that bring those materials back. I'll tell you, those asteroid mining companies, much better at the asteroid mining than the reentry pods. As somebody that's very good at reentry pods, happy to sell my reentry pods to whoever needs them. So we're going to be a part of that either way.
So you're a reentry pod czar.
I am a reentry pod czar. Yeah, I've got about 134 million of contracts with the United States government for my reentry pods.
Sorry to interrupt, but the 134 million from the government, what do they want to come home?
What they're interested in is our basically reentry pods come in hot, fast, and heavy, and they come in at like 13 Gs, which you and I, we would not survive if we were tucked inside of one of our reentry pods. You and I would die pretty quick. The drugs on board kind of look like table salt. You can shake those things around. You can spin it up to 13 Gs. It's still going to come out the other side looking like table salt. And so that was what we built because it was what was cheapest for us to build for the drug business. The Air Force got really interested because they were like, hey, this actually looks a heck of a lot like a sort of missile coming in from space. This is an area of technology that we're looking to sort of start to understand better and develop. And so we would like to use you basically as a testing mechanism so we can test out these types of technologies while your sort of pod is coming back down. And so, for example, that satellite that we have up there right now basically has an Air Force Research Laboratory, which is the group that is responsible for these types of technologies within the Air Force, with what's known as a spectrometer on board. It's basically something that's going to look outside the window of the pod and look at the plume and see the signature of what that is, and then correlate that to what is our heat shield made out of. So in the future, if the Chinese, let's say, are shooting out a space missile, we now know different types of materials and what plumes they create, so we can figure out what that Chinese basically space missile sort of is made out of. So we kind of have this sort of two-part sort of business where the tar of sort of drug reactors and reentry pods, and happy to peddle either of them, whoever wants either.
Isn't there also going to be a big business theoretically, because we talk about all of these lower Earth orbit, now that, I know Starlink has tens of thousands and all, these new smaller satellites, et cetera, et cetera. Now, space is pretty big, but they're knocking into each other more. When they do, they can break up to thousands of pieces, which all become like bullets that can go through space stations, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't there be a big business in sort of catching all these sort of debris and then pulling it back down to Earth so we don't have, what's the...
Kessler syndrome.
Kessler syndrome.
I think it's a little fugazi, sort of the whole thing. It's not to say that there's not some amount of, sort of crowding and things are moving fast up there, but there's two things that I'd say. First, remember, the Earth is very big. It sounds like you're either a pilot or like to fly a lot. I'm sure you've looked out the window and noticed a lot of times you're over the U.S., it's very, very, very empty.
Space is even more empty.
Space is even more empty than Earth is, and so it's really, really empty. Now things are moving way faster up there, so there is that sort of downside, but it's still very, very empty. So that's part one. Part two is people think of our atmosphere that you and I are breathing right here down on the Earth as having this binary limit of it stops here and then you're in space and there's nothing there. Not totally true. Even where our current sort of factory is sort of right now in orbit above us, it's at about sort of 525 sort of kilometers, so quite high up there. There's still an atmosphere up there. It's very, very small. It's very thin. You and I couldn't breathe or anything, but there's a little bit of molecules that hit into our satellite and basically ever so slightly slow it down, so that if we didn't do anything over the course of 5 years,
eventually
that satellite would come down. So if there were to be a crash up there right now, the vast majority of that debris at the altitude that we're at up there would come down over the course of 3 to 5 years, basically. So there is this kind of natural vacuum cleaner that exists. Now, as you go higher and higher, that vacuum cleaner gets weaker and weaker. So for the people that are 10,000 kilometers up and there's an accident, okay, those guys and that debris is up there forever.
Where do you see, we were talking about, where your factories become bigger, and
Yep.
It reminds me when you brought up Portugal, I was thinking Cape Horn, when you had all the ships had to be victualed in Punta Arenas, in Tierra del Fuego, and they would go around Cape Horn and then they would get fish. And because I've actually been there, and there's still 1 million feral sheep and pigs and stuff because they just left. It's a crazy city. It used to be the richest city in the world, and it was second after Paris as it got streetlights because it was super rich because everyone. And then the Panama Canal happened, and now it's sort of a ghost town of weird Croatian and Germanic villages because they were whalers, I guess. And it's now a staging place to go to Antarctica. And I thought of you because I was like, oh, that would be a staging station where you get there, get all your stuff, and then you go off to the South Pacific or wherever it was.
Totally.
So this is my long-winded question. Where in the next 5 to 10 years are we going with these space technologies that, first of all, we've just sort of successfully, recently, really commercialized space from the big nation-state actors like NASA, et cetera, to Starlink and et cetera, and your company, Varda. And so what do the next 5 years look like, not just for your business, but in space in general?
Totally. I was bringing up a personal anecdote, one of my first date with my now wife in March of 2019. And I told her on our, sort of first date, I was like, look, I just do want to flag that, if this does, go anywhere and is serious, I always tell people that if you want to stay with me for the long term, it is very likely that we'll end up having to go to space as a part of my work. And I would want my wife and kids, sort of there with me. And at the time she was like, haha, San Francisco tech bros always have these like ridiculous, crazy ideas. Like, this kid's obviously a schmuck and has no idea what he's talking about. He's never like, worked in space, isn't going to space anytime soon.
Sure.
And then start the space company and raise funding.
Have a blood bag?
And,
you don't need a blood. You're young enough.
Yeah, exactly. If anything, I'm the one that they're taking the blood bag from.
There you go.
Sorry. Yeah.
So you said to her, I want to live in space. She said, you're crazy. And now it doesn't look so crazy.
Now it doesn't look so crazy. And so credit to her, she went to Epcot in Disneyland in Florida, and it has a like launch training ride where it like spins you up and shakes you and provides the G-forces. And she was like, normally I wouldn't go on that type of ride, but like I need to start getting ready.
There you go. I like
so, I'd like to think that that's maybe a signal of, where we're headed over like the next, sort of 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
We're probably the most dynamic moment since the Apollo era, in all things, sort of space. And these things can always go haywire. Look, Elon gets hit by a bus, Falcon 9, somehow, doesn't work. The Russians send a nuke into low Earth orbit and kill all the Starlink satellites, and that business isn't doable anymore. Like we could definitely, sort of backtrack, sort of from where we are. But I think if you keep, sort of going along the path that we're on, I think one of the first things that you'll see is for the first time, sort of humans that are up in orbit for an extended period of time, not by NASA budget. So I don't know if you know Jared Isaacman.
Yeah.
He's the now new acting NASA administrator, but late last year was, sort of the first private astronaut to do a spacewalk. And so he, sort of went up in a Dragon capsule, that's the SpaceX capsule, opened up, basically the hatch and actually extended his head outside to, sort of look at the Earth. I think it's an incredible, like, momentous, sort of moment. I think one of the next moments will be the first time that, like, sort of a private citizen on something that's not a government piece of infrastructure is up in space for, call it a week or something like that. Maybe it's a research trip. Maybe it's somebody doing it for tourism. But, like, I think that's highly likely to happen over the course of the next, call it 3 to 4 years. I think 5 years from today, I'm not sure there's going to be a huge next inflection point beyond that. But if you go out to, like, a 10-year period, 100%. Boots back on the moon. We'll have permanent infrastructure on the moon. Starship almost certainly will be online, and those things will start to look like, sort of, you could empty one of those out and leave them in orbit rather than bring it down, and that basically looks like a station effectively. And so I have this bet with my wife that by, I think it's January 1st, 2032, there will be over 100 humans that are up in orbit on a continuous basis, but that also are worth less than $100 million each. So it's not just the billionaires that are up there, although I think most billionaires will be more risk averse, but that was the sort of qualification.
I think look, a lot of these billionaires read a lot of science fiction.
Yeah.
And so therefore let's go.
Yeah. But I don't know if you know the peak today that we've ever had of like number of humans up in orbit at the same time, 18.
And how about, why is it so problematic to go back to the moon A and then put bases on the moon B?
A bunch of things that, sort of make the, sort of moon hard. We didn't, touch on this, but like the Chinese are ahead of us, sort of right now. So they, late last year, I want to say, they managed to send up a rocket with a lander, land on the backside of the moon, which we had never done before, which requires like relay communications, right, to get down there. And then robotically scooped up a like drilling core to basically test like what were the materials, et cetera, so they can figure out where to set up their mining operation. Brought that back onto the vehicle, and so it's like they not only have landed but done like a material, return of the moon rocks. That's not even in our plans. Now, the thing that is kind of cool is I do think the United States is setting it up in a more commercial, non-state driven way. They basically took all the lessons learned from like the SpaceX launch contracts, and they set up what I think is probably one of the coolest programs in NASA today. It's called the CLPS program, CLPS, Commercial Lunar Payload Services. NASA normally likes to be super dictatorial about you got to do things this way, this way, this way. In this program, all they said was, we will pay you, I think it's $50,000 per kilo that you get down to the surface of the moon. However you want to do it. If you do it with $10,000 per kilo, $20,000 per kilo, $45,000 per kilo, I don't mind no matter what. Whatever profit is yours, the profit's yours.
What are they going to do with it?
Right now, they have a couple different companies. So you have Firefly, you have Blue Origin, you have Intuitive Machines, and you have SpaceX that are all on it. So 4 different companies. 2 of those companies have lunar landers that are about to actually attempt lunar landing, basically attempts over the course of, I think it's like the next 2 weeks. That's pretty damn cool because now you have this like distributed commercial,
cool.
Sort of base.
So it's more of an economic incentive to get data and information, not like the rocks are worth exponentially more money.
Not yet, but I think what they're trying to set up is right now they're one-way trips, and so NASA will pay you $50K, and they're trying to stimulate the market by being like the first buyer. But there's a handful of, I believe, like rovers that are going to be unloaded on the moon that are going to go do drilling, and they're going to send data back, etc. There's companies that are here, 45 minutes from where this studio is, that are starting to send up like trucks that will basically do paving. So they're going to like pave landing pads. They're going to start to build roads and things like that, infrastructure. There's people that are bringing up equipment that can take the lunar lunar soil and turn it into solar panels. And so people are starting to basically, like, on these commercial missions, NASA's paying both the lander $50,000 a kilo, but they're also incentivizing some of these companies on this early infrastructure. There's a decent amount of private investment going into these as well. And so I think it's an interesting, China's this very top-down, dictatorial, authoritative sort of approach. Here's what we're going to do. Here's when the humans are going to land. The U.S. so far is taking this approach of, like, let's, spur a commercial market. And yes, there'll still be some, like, I'm sure Trump and Jared Isaacman, when they get their heads together and decide what they want their space strategy to be, because Jared still hasn't been confirmed yet, they'll for sure come with some top-down edicts of, like, boots on the moon by 2027 or something like that. But it's going to be this reliance on this, like, distributed commercial infrastructure that I think is closer to the Portuguese, sort of approach from, the 16th century. And so, yeah, I think it's like, it's crazy that, like, we're sitting here today and it's like, there might be, like, in 2 weeks, we might come back and say, look, the Chinese were ahead of us, but now we've got 2 different lunar landers, and, both of them have different capabilities and different use cases. And, one of them has a, paver that went on the surface that's now paving a landing pad for a Starship to land there next year.
Yeah, I thought that making drugs in space was very esoteric, but what's your business, Shane? I'm a moon paver.
Yes. There's literally a business that's like an hour from here that is like a moon paver. That is their shtick.
Well, we're going to call them next.
Yeah. Happy to put you in touch with them.
It's fascinating stuff. It's really interesting. And, I want to keep, actually all this stuff is happening in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. When all this stuff happens, come back.
Happily.
Tell us what the hell it all means.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see your factories in full effect when they're way stations for our interstellar, interplanetary exploration, much like the Portuguese went out into the world and said, let's check it out. Great. Thank you for being here today, Delian. It was great to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. And if you're ever in retirement or itching to be, sort of more athletic than your body is capable of, lunar retirement homes.
That's
Great
me.
place.
That's me to a T. I definitely want to be more athletic than I am.
Moon's the great place to do it.
All right, brother.
Sweet. Great to meet you, Shane.
Great to meet you.